Thank you.
Well, I still can. Thanks. Well, I had a whole lecture prepared on a part of this war that dealt with the sea lanes and how China is leveraging what's going on in the sea lanes in Yemen and so forth as part of this war to create an alternative maritime structure. And I can get into that in questions. But listening to Trevor and listening to James and John, I realized that what happened on October 7th and what we see in Israel is really the laboratory or the guinea pig of down road what happens when what they're describing takes deep root. And I think you really have to understand what happened on October 7th in that context. So what do I mean by that? Let me go back for 1 minute to history. Israel was created as a socialist country. It was very difficult to succeed in Israel in any way if you were not a member of the Labor Party. And the Labor Party was not democratic socialist. It was socialist. My wife, she was born in Israel. Her father was a soccer player, professional soccer player, for a team that was affiliated with the opposition party, what is today known as Likud, the party which ran. When he got married, they told him, "You're not going to get an apartment unless you quit." He hit the team. He didn't quit, so my wife was born in a corrugated shack. Eventually, after half a year and so forth, he relented, he resigned, he got his apartment. You couldn't become an officer in the Israeli military unless you were a member of the Labor Party. This happened in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. What happened, though, and the Labor Party felt that through that they could politically control the country essentially for eternity. Two things happened, though. Demographics changed, and the 73 war happened. Catastrophic war, number one. And number two, demographically, more religious people were born. Immigrants from Oriental Jewish communities came to Israel, which are more traditional. Non-socialists immigrated after World War II and the Holocaust. They just took all the refugees, and a lot of them were not socialists. So over time, in 1977, lo and behold, a right-wing government gets elected in Israel. Absolute disaster. So what happens then? The processes that James and Trevor describe is what then kicked in. The secular socialist elites of Israel retreated into the institutions to essentially disempower the elected government of Israel. And how did that work? The courts essentially devolved into appointing their own successors. They packed the courts, and then the courts were charged for appointing their own successors. The military, well, it was very difficult to maintain the ideological litmus test for advance to officer corps in the military overtly, so the officer corps got to appoint the officer corps, including the top levels of the military, appointed the top levels of the military. The education system, same deal. So what you had was essentially the more demographically the right in Israel won, the more institutionally the democratic government of Israel was disempowered. To give you an idea of what happened with the courts, John's not here right now, but at any rate, the Israeli courts then realized even there they had a problem. So they basically said, they used the threat of International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, war crimes, to say that the Israeli courts have got to essentially have authority over every function of the Israeli military. So no Israeli operation, even the movement of a tank, requires a legal sign-off. The whole point of that was that essentially you couldn't overpower the courts anymore. The International Criminal Court and so forth was the leverage. It was essentially the bludgeon that the court system in Israel would use to overpower the democratic structure underneath, or the military structure underneath. So you see how this international structure, legal structure, and so forth comes together. And that's how global governance was used to essentially undermine. This is very important for us, because when we look at the WHO and this whole issue of the WHO and so forth, you see there how it all works. You see how it intrudes on the sovereignty of a country. And then the institutions that are anchored to the international structures become the mechanisms to become a government within the government, or a shadow government that actually has the real power. Anyway, I don't want to get into too much of these mechanics of it, but essentially all the mechanisms then started kicking in. You started having the courts, the ICC. All of a sudden, still there was the problem of demographics and the fact that the country was drifting rightward, becoming more religious, more traditional, etc. So you started seeing all the other stuff, the people versus the enemy of the people. The Oslo process, you remember everybody used to say, oh, you have the peacemakers and the enemies of peace. As if an Israeli parent who sends his kids to the military, and remember the universal conscription there, or their husbands, because you have to serve not only the 3.5 years when you turn 18, or 2.5 if you're a woman, you have to serve 2 months every year until you're 55. This was 10, 20 years ago. It changed, and that's a whole other issue. But back 20 years ago, it was that. So you're sending your son, your daughter, your husband, etc. Actually, yeah. You don't want to go to war. I mean, you want to have peace. You're not an enemy of peace. But you also understood that inviting the PLO into your home was not a good idea. But it used the terms that James mentioned. Instead of the word people versus enemy of the people, it was the peacemakers versus the enemy of peace. And that, you delegitimized half the population. They had no right of protest. They were arrested when they would protest, etc. You had last summer, over the year, so you had, it still didn't help. Over the 19 of the last 22 years, the right in Israel won the election. The government was essentially disempowered, but the right won the election. Then they managed, through a parliamentary trick, the left managed to sort of get power for 2 years, from 2020 to 2022. A right-wing party essentially joined with the left to overcome a parliamentary deadlock, and a left-wing government essentially came to power. But they fell after 2 years pretty quickly, and the right was elected again with 64 seats out of 120. Not a great majority, but a real majority. And all of a sudden, the same terms again appeared. Instead of people versus enemy of the people, you had democracy versus the enemies of democracy. Of course, democracy meant that you opposed who was just elected the government of Israel, rather than actually respecting the election of the government of Israel. Now, why was this government, this is before October 7th, so rejected? I mean, part of it was they were fed up, the left was fed up with losing the power they had just had for a little bit. But the second thing was, Netanyahu, the prime minister, and his party and the other parties ran on this idea of the deep state. They ran on the idea that young kids are sitting there in the military and they have a lawyer on their back. Every move they make, they have a lawyer on their back. And the lawyers were not anymore protecting them from the International Criminal Court, as was billed. They were referring their cases to the State Department and Blinken, to the International Criminal Court, to international organizations. By the way, that's another thing. The courts in Israel took away the need for standing to bring a case to the Supreme Court. Taking away the need for standing meant anybody could bring any case to the Supreme Court. So all of a sudden you had 5 NGOs in Israel mushroom into 250 NGOs, funded by Europe, the European Union, the UN, etc. Every single day there were cases brought against Israeli soldiers to the courts. So essentially the Israeli military became paralyzed. Everybody was afraid for their kids, for their husbands going to jail, etc. Any rate, you saw then the government take over. They basically said, this has to end. We have to begin to separate the courts out and make the courts independent, but no longer the government, essentially. What happened? Earlier, and I neglected to say this, we have an Attorney General's office in the United States government. It's a political appointee. Under Obama, we see how dangerous that can be. But it's also a democratic, when normally functioning, it's a democratic break on the power of the courts, or it's essentially, it helps implement the legal agenda of the government. In Israel, the Supreme Court ruled that the Attorney General's office in Israel works for the Supreme Court. It is loyal to the law of Israel, not to the government of Israel. And they are the law, and that therefore they control the Attorney General's office, not the political establishment. Moreover, they said that every lawyer in every bureau of the Israeli government works ultimately for the Attorney General. So any legal officer in the IDF, in the Environment Ministry, works for the Attorney General, which works for the Supreme Court in Israel, which appoints itself over and over again. So, of course, the Israeli government said, we can't rule like this anymore. And they started taking it on. And then you had, the last year before the war, violence, demonstration. It was not as violent as BLM, the Summer of Love 2020, but it was bad. It was bad, and toward the end, you had former prime ministers from the left, you had generals from the military, retired generals, calling for desertion, openly saying you have no military if you continue with these, quote, reforms. And that was the climate in which October 7th erupted. Hamas saw this, the Israeli military was unraveling, and that's essentially the backstop. What you see here underway is not just the loss of freedom. It ends in a catastrophe like that. It ends not only with a slow erosion of your liberty, it can end in a catastrophic defeat. And that's ultimately, I think, what China's trying to do by encouraging all this. There are a lot of other issues. For example, Soros. Soros was mentioned. The Palestinian encampments, we now know, are funded by organizations that Soros put forward. Soros was deeply involved in a lot of this activity in Israel, the New Israel Fund and so forth. Israeli generals had to go through a seminar to become generals, actually staff to become flag rank. You had to go through a foundation that was ultimately run by Soros to become a flag rank officer in the Israeli military. So you can see how this all worked. The reflexive method that James described, also very much in effect there, where, again, this problem, reaction, and predetermined solution, that is exactly over and over and over again, even in terms of strategy. The Israeli military, the problem was that with the way the military was structured. So the old socialist secular elite made sure that their kids got into the best units, and there are two of the best units. One is intelligence, because the Unit 8200, where basically if you get into Unit 8200, you go into the startup ecosystem, and you become a multimillionaire in a startup, and I mean, amazing. And then you have access through the business elite, which are also tied into this structure. And then the other one was the Air Force, because going into the Air Force as a pilot, you were the elite of society. And through that, they argued, okay, we know that the religious are growing, we know that the Oriental Jews are growing, and the Russian immigrants are growing, and the Ethiopian immigrants are growing, and so forth. We own Zionism because we are the pilots. And the pilots defend against the Iranian nuclear program. And that is the only threat we face. There's not going to be another ground war. There's not going to be anything. Look, Syria collapsed. Egypt's at peace. Jordan's at peace. Saudi Arabia wants to make peace. Where is there going to be another war coming from until October 7th? So, and by the way, the legal thing, people sitting on the back, well, who faces the legal? It's the poor infantry guy sitting in Hebron who's facing the Palestinians every day. He's the one facing all the trials, not the pilot or so forth. So even strategy in Israel was defined around this social political question. It was redefined around exclusively the nuclear program in Iran. I'm not saying that's not a threat. That is a grave threat. I'm the first to say it's a threat, and I've dedicated, half my life working to try to stop Iran's nuclear program. But it wasn't the only threat Israel faced. And as a result, what happened was on October 7th, to give you an idea, in 1973, Israel had 225,000 regular soldiers and could mobilize up to 475,000 reserves. 1973, Israel was 3.5 million people. Israel is now about 9 to 10 million people. It had 165,000 regular soldiers. Now, when it mobilized, it self-mobilized. I was there on October 7th. People were not called up. They showed up. 700,000. And that's the hopeful story here. Tanks, for example. Israel had about 3,500 tanks in 1973. They had 800 on October 7th, and they were going down to 400. Luckily, they were mothballed. They weren't sold. So they pulled them out, and they had to fix them up. But literally, the Israeli military had demobilized because there was not going to be a threat. The whole concept was organized around the social idea that the only threat involved the units that the labor socialist kids went into, and therefore they, quote, own Zionism. They own the state. They bear the burden. They're the ones defending it. They own the state. And that was what was said in the summer of 2023 over and over and over again. You will have no defense if you go ahead with reform. You have no army if you go ahead with reform. You will have no Iran if you go ahead with reform. That's the climate that then led to October 7th. Were there foreign elements involved? Yes. I have on my phone, I'll show you guys afterwards. I was wandering around Tel Aviv, October 6th, the day before the war. And what was there? Painted on the walls were Antifa flags. Antifa had become part of this overall revolt against the government of Israel, trying to bring it down. Any rate, so what is the hopeful sign? So, as I said, I was there on October 7th. It doesn't seem that way out of the country. It was a near thing. It was a near thing. Hamas got 20 miles into Israel in the farthest reach. It needed only one more city before it linked up with the West Bank. The north, Hezbollah was supposed to attack. They didn't believe Hamas would succeed, so they waited a few hours before they started their attacks. And by then, as I said, the Israeli military was self-mobilizing. People literally picked up, showed up. my friends, they were calling me as they were in the car. They had stopped by any base that was close by, got weapons, and headed to the south with their own cars, picking up whatever soldier, whatever person they could, as they could, to basically run into battle. The Israeli Air Force never operated for the first 8 hours. Israeli helicopters didn't operate. Israeli tanks, there was a training base about 10 miles away. All women soldiers. They literally just got into their training tanks and they drove up to the front. They killed about 500 terrorists, those women, with about 10 tanks. It literally, you had. Now, what's happening in Israel? Who's really paying the price of Israeli defense? About 10% of Israel is national religious. That is, they're nationalist and religious, not ultra-Orthodox, just national religious, 10%. The death rate right now among soldiers, over 50% national religious. Faith, freedom, family. That is what is saving the country. That is what's making that nation survive. It is literally the willpower of the soldiers who are, enlisted or lower level officers. They are literally driving the country to survival and now organizing to deliver victory. And they're being held back still to this moment by the elite of the military, which is saying there's no concept of victory. You can't really win. It's an idea, Hamas. You can't beat an idea, et cetera. It's, oh, well, the hostages, you got to bring them all back. Just give in. We'll come back 2 years later and we'll finish this if we have to. They're not willing to win the war. And this is what the Israeli government right now is dealing with, in addition to the Biden administration, denying weapons, restraining, encouraging the International Criminal Court and so forth. But again, faith, freedom, family. It's literally overpowering everything. And slowly but surely, the Israelis, in a muddled, difficult, much longer way, are getting to where they have to get. I'm sure there will be a war with Lebanon in the next few weeks. And then that leads them directly into conflict with Iran. And it's really now an Iranian-Israeli conflict, fought almost despite, the United States is giving the weapons, but some of them, but it's with the heavy price. You can't use them. So at this point, the Israelis will pull it off. But again, returning back, it's not really about Israel. As I said, this is about, it's the guinea pig. When Trevor said freedom, family, and faith, this really is the only path to survival. This is what we can win with. Structures are important. Efforts are incredibly important. But what you're fighting for and your clarity of understanding what you're fighting for, that's what's going to win this. And it can win this. Israel was a socialist country. These guys had all the advantages that James had outlined of taking over the system, and they took over the system. Well, they held on to the system. And yet, they're losing. They're losing control of Israel. And even in the war, they're losing control. Israel emerging from this war is not going to be what the left in Israel wishes for. It's going to be a very different country. So at any rate, I'll end it there, and